Hopefully we're live and this is all good. I always get confused by this bit. I think we're live. Let's see, I'll have a look at the little chat. Give me a shout when you can see me. Yeah, I think we're good. Slow running. Yeah, I am slow running, all right. I'm just going to wait till I can see myself on the stream. Okay, good. I think people are saying they can see me, so that means that we're good. All right, okay. God damn, I've been watching a lot of Jay Dyer recently, which has been quite painful. Anyone who knows, anyone who's suffered in that particular fate themselves before, hopefully you can sympathize. The sacrifices I am making for my art. So, cheers, got a nice cool beer. What I was going to try and do tonight was do something a bit different to before, a bit more ambitious. I'm kind of stretching my streaming skills a bit, loaded in a bunch of clips, and I'm going to try and work my way through them. And I think what I want to do on this session is address some of the stuff from Jay Dyer on a couple of different levels. So obviously, if you don't know who he is, let's start with this background. First of all, last couple of streams we've been doing Orthodox pre-sup debate bro people. So we did Jim Bob, we did Father Deacon Ananias, and now we're doing Jay Dyer. So they're a gang of three, let's say, and yeah, so they run broadly the same sorts of arguments. Certainly, FDA and Jay are quite tight, and they say the same stuff. So I think it makes sense to sort of wrap up this little series by finishing off with Jay. So he's a pre-sup. If you've seen the last two videos, it's very similar stuff. I imagine actually that most people watching this know who he is because he's quite famous on the internet in these circles. Give me a shout if my sound. Hopefully, you can hear that tapping and it's coming through the right microphone this week. But give me a shout if the levels are okay. And I previously had a debate. Was it a debate? It was a discussion with Jay in the past on presuppositional stuff. And I'm not going to show any clips from that discussion tonight for a couple of reasons. Partly, it's kind of cringe looking back on it now. I listened to a bit of it. I listened to a bit of Nathan's comment, sort of bad apologetics review thing. They did a 7-hour stream, and I don't know, half an hour of that was them watching it. And although that was hilarious, their commentary was hilarious. It did make me think. I let Jay have far too much time to talk, and I wasn't challenging him very much. I'm not very confrontational like that, and that, I think, in a way, gave people the impression that what he was saying was more coherent than it actually was, listening back to it. And I think I want to sort of expose some of that tonight, because I think actually since that, in the 5 years or whatever it's been since then, I've seen quite a lot more of Jay Dyer's stuff, and sometimes he's very unpleasant, and I think it's fair enough to go in on, you know, his philosophy, for what lack of a better word. I'm going to go into that in quite a lot of depth at some point towards, like, as we go through this stream, we'll get deeper and deeper, basically. So if you're a Jay Dyer fan, and I hope there are Jay Dyer fans who can challenge themselves to watch this type of video, feel free to skip over the beginning bits if you want to, but I think that the first bits are going to be important too. But just rest assured, we're going to have some fun at the beginning, but we're also going to get into the actual content as we keep going. So I'm not going to shy away from any of the philosophy, even though to begin with we're going to be talking about some stuff that's not exactly philosophical content, but it's stuff about like Jay in particular. And I think it's fair to bring that up in this context because of the type of character that he is in some respect. And what I mean by that is that often he displays behaviours that seem to me rather unhelpful for, let's say, a philosophy communicator, if that's how he takes himself to be. He's not just a philosopher, he's not just a YouTube philosopher, he's also, I think it's fair to say, a conspiracy theorist. You know, he's been on the Alex Jones show. People will know that he recently went on Tucker Carlson, so he's in this kind of right-wing ecosphere online, has written a book about whatever, like conspiracy theories and Hollywood, that type of stuff, right? So he's also a comedian, and he has kind of comedy series on his YouTube channel as well. He's a Jay of all trades. So he's not just a philosopher, but I'm going to dig into the philosophical content. I guess I just have a grumble about the way he carries himself, and I don't think he needs to do that, and he should. I should have been more forceful when we talked before in calling that type of stuff out. Although I guess he was perfectly polite to me when we talked, so maybe there was nothing for me to call out at that point. But I'm happy to bring up some of these things now. So let's start off with the first clip. So the first one might not come as a surprise to some of you who've been following this stuff before. So let's get on to this.
He's just got his head up his ass. He's just ignorant of philosophy. Like literally,
I have a master's in philosophy. You have no philosophy training.
Clearly,
you would know that's a fallacy and a formal argument.
Right. So there, if you missed it, that's Jay Dyer having a debate with T-Jump. I strongly recommend you don't watch that debate because you will shorten your life listening to that. It's literally unlistenable. I mean, it's just two people talking over each other at the same time for about 2 hours, and it goes nowhere, and there's just no point in any of it. But what happened there was T-Jump, who's a YouTuber who is quite difficult to listen to at the best of times anyway. Whatever, I'm not throwing any shade on T-Jump in this stream, but he's not like an academic or anything either, just like Jay. But Jay pretended. Well, Jay leant in and said to him, "I've got a master's degree," right? Because they were having a conversation about whether an appeal to authority was a fallacy. And Jay leant in and said, "I've got a master's degree," and then something like, "You've got no philosophy degree," ha ha ha, and laughed to himself about it. And first of all, it's a dick move, right? It's a dick. You don't have to have a degree in philosophy to be good at philosophy, right? You definitely don't. Before anyone tries to say, "Oh, well, Alex is being, elitist," and says you have to have a degree or a PhD or something, that's exactly the opposite of what I'm saying. You definitely don't. But Jay is saying that he does to someone who doesn't, as a way of belittling them. That's what he's doing. It's not philosophical. It's not. It's just a blatant power move. He's trying to humiliate T-Jump by saying that he's got a degree and T-Jump doesn't. Something along those lines, right? But then the thing is, my friend, Skeptical Informant, who had a debate with Jay Dyer himself, and he said that it's okay for me to say this, he did some research and he phoned the college that Jay went to, where he got his degree. Because Jay says he's got a master's degree in philosophy there, it's quite clear. He says it again in the debate. He said it in other places as well. It's quite easy to find him saying that. But it turns out that college never offered a master's degree in philosophy, so it's not clear that could be true. And if it's not true, Jay must have known that it's not true, and it's quite clear that his intent was to make the audience believe that it was true. And saying something that you know isn't true with the intent to get other people to believe it is a lie. That's what it means to lie. So Jay just lied there, and it's quite. I mean, I believe that he lied. I also made a post about it on YouTube where I said, I think Jay Dyer is lying about having a master's degree in philosophy. He went to Murray State University, but he seemed to have never offered a master's degree in philosophy. And you can check it yourself. Like ask your favourite large language model to go and do a search to see if they've ever done a master's degree in philosophy, because I don't think you'll find that they did. Jay replied to my post and he said, I've always said and included ABT, all but thesis. Now, that is, I'm tempted to say another lie, honestly. He's saying that he didn't, I'm saying that he lied about that, and his reply is to lie again about whether he lied about it. Because I just played the clip and he didn't say, I've always included all but thesis. He didn't say it then. And I mean, he must have known at the time that he said it, that he didn't have a master's degree. And he must have known when he wrote this, that on that occasion, that he didn't say all but thesis. So he doesn't always say and included all but thesis. Sometimes, at least, he leans in a debate to try and humiliate someone by claiming to have a degree that he doesn't have, right? But it's kind of like, if you just think about it for a moment, again, I'm not saying he has to have a degree. It doesn't matter if he's got a degree, right? I'm not actually interested in whether he's got a degree. But the lie itself, the second lie, trying to say that he does, that he always qualifies it, and that somehow, that mitigating qualification that he chucks on the end, then in a way, if you think about it, it doesn't really help, because like, if you just do everything except pass the course by writing a thesis or whatever it is that they examine you on, all that means is that you, at the very most, if we believe that somehow he did sit through master's level courses on a degree course that they never offered, let's say maybe they did, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, and he sat through it. His line is that he sat on those courses, but he didn't do the thesis at the end. But the thing is, the thesis, doing the thing at the end that they examine you on, is the public thing, that it means that somebody has assessed you and said, yeah, this guy paid attention. He wasn't just sitting there, right? He learned something, and he's able to demonstrate that by doing something like a thesis or an exam or a viva or whatever it is. And if you don't do that, then all you're saying is that you sat on some courses, right? Anybody could do that. It doesn't mean that you've passed. It doesn't mean you've got a master's degree, right? Because you could have been anywhere on the scale of between being brilliant and would have passed definitely if he'd done it, to was failing completely and wouldn't have passed. And we don't know where he sits because he didn't do the thesis. So you don't get to claim that you've got a master's degree if you didn't do the hard thing that people who do it do in order to get told by a peer or by like an academic or an authority that you did your bit, you passed, you listened, you could regurgitate the stuff or whatever. So I think he lied about it. I think he lied about lying about it, and it was a stupid lie, because even if it was true, it wouldn't really work as a justification. And why am I bringing this up at the beginning? It's not just to throw shade at Jay. It's just to show that, like, clearly you've got to be an utter sycophant to think differently to this, right? Jay sometimes says stuff that's not true. That's my point. He will, on occasion, at the very least, sometimes say stuff that makes him look good, that's strategically helpful to him, even though it's not true. So he's got like an agenda. You've got to think to yourself, maybe sometimes if he's saying something, especially if it's in a debate, that you should question whether or not it's true. Is it right? Is it really true? Because I think once the penny drops and you let that chink of armor go through, and you think, sometimes he does just bullshits, right? Like Frankfurt's definition of bullshit is saying something, regardless of the truth value of it. You're not really saying, you're just not interested in whether it's true. You're doing it for a different reason. And clearly there, he wasn't concerned with whether it was true or not. The purpose for him saying that he had a master's degree was to belittle T-Jump. And that's a dick move, right? It just is a dick move. And I think it just calls into question, like, the character of the guy. And like, Jay, if you listen to this, you don't need to do that. You're an articulate, intelligent person. You've got a big following. You don't have anything to feel ashamed about or insecure. Don't pretend to do something that you haven't done, right? You don't need to. It's lame. So I think that's poor, right? Poor behavior. And the second clip here, I'm just going to play this. Admittedly, we're going from one dumpster fire to another. We've gone from Jay Dyer talking to T-Jump to the Piers Morgan show, and I don't know whether this is going up in the world or down. But let me just play this, just a minute and a half or so. Trying to play it anyway.
Yeah. So earlier in the first section, when we talked about Peterson, we were talking about what was good for men.
Yeah.
And whether Tate was good or Peterson was good. And now we're talking about ethics in the sexual domain, which there's no basis in their worldview for anything to be morally, objectively right or wrong, other than their personal preferences. So if there's nothing objectively wrong, there's no reason why bigotry is wrong. Why is bigotry wrong?
Well, support your claim. Don't run from your claim. Support it. Right? We have no. You're saying we as atheists have no basis of morality. Support that.
Yeah. No epistemic basis for getting an ought from an is.
Yeah, that's a claim. Okay. Well, you're saying atheists.
No, it's an argument. It's a famous argument.
Right? You're saying that atheists can't account for morality. So what's the argument for that?
You can't get an ought from an is the argument. Back to Hume.
It looks like you don't know what an argument is. Come on, reason. Try to go from one line of reasoning to another. Do you know what an argument is?
You cannot get an ought from an is. You're an atheist. In a materialistic worldview, there's no ought.
What does that have to do with atheism?
In a materialistic, atheistic worldview, there are no oughts.
First of all, I'm not a materialist.
You don't know the basic problem of ought from is?
That's just another claim. That's just another
claim. It's not a
claim.
claim, it's an argument. It's a famous historical...
Look,
you don't know the difference between a claim and an argument.
Claim, you can't defend it.
It's an argument. It goes back to David Hume.
Can you tell us what an argument is?
You didn't even know that.
Right?
You don't know the difference between...
Look what just happened. Look what just happened. This guy said...
What just happened is that you didn't know the difference between an argument and a claim.
Why are you over-talking me? Why are you scared? Let me talk, right? You just claimed that atheists don't have a foundation of morality. I asked you to defend it, and then you said, you can't get an ought from an is. What the heck?
That's the argument. That's correct.
Where are you going to get from that premise, right? You can't derive that.
It's an argument. It's not a premise. It goes back to David Hume. You just didn't know that.
Okay, can we...
All right, so I think there's a couple of things to bring out in that. The way that... I mean, okay, it's not exactly great behavior on anybody's side there, right? I picked a clip that's about half an hour into the discussion. It starts off kind of relatively cordial, but cordiality breaks down not long into that. Danny's obviously already wound up by that point and is interrupting Jay, so fair enough, whatever. The bit that really kind of like, there's no need for Jay to do this kind of impression bit in the middle. It's like, it's noisy. You're making noises. You're like, what's going on? I don't understand that. Like it's guttural. It's like the lowest common denominator behavior. It's just poor. Again, Jay, you're better than that. You don't need to do that. Why are you acting so immaturely in a discussion, even if it is the Piers Morgan show? And often Jay talks about, masculinity and sort of guiding men and, young, impressionable men, presumably, who are watching his content, talking about what it is to be masculine. And I guess this is in the eye of the beholder, but, to me, being confident in your own ideas and being respectful enough to listen to what someone else is saying, even if you completely disagree with them, even if you hate that person, you can set a role model. You could be a role model with your public position, and you could act like a grown-up. You could act like a man, and with some honor and some dignity. And doing this that stuff's not, you act like a big baby, as far as that's how it comes across to me. And you don't need to do that. I don't know why you act like that. So on one hand, it's just bad behavior again by Jay. This is a guy who does that type of behavior, and I think it's lame and disappointing. The other thing to say about it is, and I already did a video with Phil Halpo on Skydive Phil channel about this, but he's trying to, the other thing is that he's rude, but also he says stuff that's not true to try and dominate somebody, and it's another example of this. I think maybe Dyer once read, or maybe he did he sat in a course that he never got examined on, where they went through some David Hume or whatever. He's read something about it. Maybe he even read David Hume himself. But if he did, he seems to have forgotten exactly what the argument was about, because Dyer then, as you heard him, was saying, he seems to think that David Hume's idea is that if you're a materialist, right, if you're an atheist, then you're a materialist. And if you're a materialist, then there is no such thing as a moral value, because all there is like material bumping into one another or something. He thinks that's the lesson that Hume was teaching, right? That's you can't get an ought from an is, right? That on materialism, there's no normativity. And that's just a completely crap misreading. It's a lazy, stereotypical misreading. Hume's argument, as we go through, and if you're curious about it, go and look at maybe I'll put a link to it in the video description after I finish this. But when we read out the crucial passage from Hume, he's setting out the argument. But Hume's idea was like, sometimes you see like an argument given by anybody, whether they're, there weren't really atheists in those days, but whether they were secular humanists or religious people or whatever, where they're saying, blah, 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 this is the case, this is the case, this is the case. And then all of a sudden, this ought to be the case. And he's saying, well, hold on a minute, where did the ought come from, right? It's about where if you have an argument where the premises are all descriptive, you're not going to get a conclusion which is normative. That's Hume's idea. That's the is-ought problem. It's got nothing to do with materialism. It's all to do with the content of premises in an argument. And Jay, I guess, conveniently forgot that. He thinks that Hume is making a point against the atheists or whatever, as if only theists would have the ability to talk about morality. Come on, bro. You can do better than that. If you just read Hume, it's not even difficult. It's poor. So what Dyer does, his shtick is and he often talks about Hume. He often talks about Kant. He's got these like favorite people that he likes to go back to. He rattles these potted histories of when he talks about empiricism. He loves to bring up Quine. He rushes through all this stuff, and he did this with me, and I wasn't really prepared for it, and it caught me off guard. Because I was struggling to be like, what is this guy talking about? Where's he going with all of this? He'd had, I guess, let's say a lot of coffee before he'd come on the stream, and he was talking very, very quickly, as he often does. And that's like a large part of how this guy argues. It's a Gish Gallop, basically. It's a Jay Gallop. He Jay Gallops through these contexts, but often what he's saying, when you slow down and think about it, just play a little clip and pause it and go through the details of what he's saying, it's just hopelessly wrong, right? It's just bad. And I think he's a guy who's not very committed to being accurate about that type of stuff. He doesn't really care if what he's saying is actually right, as according to what Hume said. He's interested in hitting Danny over the head with the inquiries into human understanding, or whatever Hume's book was called. Right? That's what he wants to do. It's a power move. He's just and that's what this is, I think, part of his masculine man thing. He thinks that's what it is to be a man, is to be a sort of aggressive, like bullying person. And again, I just think that that doesn't seem right to me at all. He should have the courage to face the truth. What did Hume actually say? Maybe Hume's argument doesn't actually fit with Dyer's shtick, but I think it's cowardly to just pretend that what he said does, and to publicly say it. And on the Piers Morgan show as well. I mean, most people watching that probably have no idea even who David Hume is. So given that, I'm just going to play one or two more clips of Dyer that are kind of just showing him getting stuff wrong before we go into what his argument is, and we'll try and unpack what his like the details of his argument. So let's play this next one.
The whole system, evidentialism and classical foundationalism, is built on the belief that you can't do circular arguments, right? So again, circular arguments are both valid and invalid in different cases and in different situations. In first order natural language, first order logic, lower order logic, it's invalid to make circular arguments. This is the basic mistake of T-Dump the other day. But at a higher level, they're unavoidable. That's the point. And that's the point that the evidentialist doesn't understand.
So Dyer's saying that circular arguments are both valid and invalid, depending on whether it's a lower order or higher order argument. But this is all I want to bring to attention here on this one is that, like, I don't think that Jay Dyer really knows what validity is in the logical sense, right? I think his grasp of logic is extremely shaky. He's the kind of guy who learns about fallacies like straw man, begging the question, appeal to authority, whatever, and he thinks that's what logic is. He doesn't distinguish logic and rhetoric, right? He thinks logic is debating, right? he doesn't really distinguish between logic and epistemology, like justification in epistemological sense, and like inferences, whatever. He regularly runs those two concepts together. And now it's kind of funny when you think about it. A circular argument, I mean, there's at least two different ways of understanding what a circular argument means, or what it means to argue in a circle. But the most straightforward way of thinking about it would be that you've got an argument, series of premises and a conclusion, and like one of the premises is the conclusion, or it's like smuggles in the conclusion. Say something like, the Bible says that God exists, so God exists, right? And maybe that smuggles in the conclusion because you think, well, the Bible was written by God, or it's inspired by God, and that's the only reason to think that the inference supports the conclusion. But if so, then it just sort of, it has the conclusion built into the premise, and in that sense it's circular. But it's valid, right, in the logical sense, because there's no way that the premises could be true and the conclusion is false, right? If the conclusion is one of the premises, then there's no way that it could be true and the conclusion could be false. So a circular argument in that sense is trivially valid, right? But when Jay says it's not valid in some sense, but it's valid in another sense, what he means is something much looser, basically a non-defined term, that he means something like acceptable, the sort of thing you can say in a debate, because he doesn't really know anything about formal logic. So that one I just thought was funny. He's gonna, if you're a Jay Dyer fan and you're watching this and you think, no, hold on, he's my champion, he's the logic guru and the philosophy bro, he knows loads about philosophy, all these people he's bested in debates, this guy's amazing at philosophy, surely how can this guy be saying he doesn't understand a basic notion in logic? But it's true, he doesn't. I believe Jay Dyer doesn't know anything basically about logic, and we can show a couple more clips about that. Let's do a couple on, like, his argument, his basic argument is, oh no, hold on, we'll come to that in a moment. Let's do this one.
But I'm going to go ahead and say, let's talk about higher order and lower order logic. So if we have normal propositions that are made, like the tree is green, whatever, we can those kinds of statements, then we move them to propositional logic, right? That's a higher order. That's a step up. So, for example, the tree is green is a lower order statement than X is Y, because now we're moving into a more higher formal type of statement.
Now the disappointing thing here is that, so there's a notion of order in logic, right? Higher order logic is a thing. First order logic is a thing. And Jay definitely doesn't know what those terms mean in logic. He's never picked up a book, never been curious about it. He talks about higher order logic, meta logic, meta epistemology, all this stuff all the time. I don't think he's ever once actually thought to himself, do you know what, I better check what that means. Maybe I'll read a book, a logic book. Oh, I don't understand all these symbols. I better sit down and learn something that's hard in order to check this thing. Or these days, just ask ChatGPT, what does it mean in logic? For higher order, what is higher order logic, right? Because he starts off by saying, we have these like natural language statements, like the grass is green or whatever, and then he says, and then we move up a level into propositional logic, and that's higher order. No, it's not. Propositional logic deals with those exact types of statements, propositions. The clue is in the name, right? That's not even first order logic. That's baby logic. That's like the equivalent of arithmetic, of like counting and adding and stuff. Like sort of thing you could teach in a school. Propositional logic. I mean, they don't teach it in school. They do teach it in philosophy courses. Certainly, I'd expect a master's degree course to know what propositional logic is. Like that is a very, very rudimentary issue. So if he doesn't know what propositional logic is, he doesn't know what validity is. This is like basic. It's like not knowing what addition is and then claiming to be a mathematician, right? And then he talks about higher order logic. But what he's saying, the distinction he's actually drawing is between a proposition and then like the grass is green, and then a version of that proposition where you've abstracted away from the content and put in like variables, like all x's are y, something like that, right? And he's calling that higher order. But that's not what logicians mean by higher order. That's just a bit more abstract, right? You've just taken the content away to reveal the logical form. You've used a variable, like, well done. That's not what higher order logic means, right? First order logic is where you have propositional logic, and then you add more vocabulary, right? Things like quantifiers, and then you think about semantics. Where the semantics of propositional logic is just truth values, right? But the semantics of first order logic is you have a domain of reference, the things that the quantifiers range over. And in first order logic, quantifiers range over objects of the domain, right? Second order logic, what happens then is you add more vocabulary to first order logic. Now you have quantifiers that range over sets of objects in the domain, right? So you have predicates of predicates, right? So there's and then it keeps going. There's just a hierarchy that keeps going of ever more higher order logics. But I'm not making this up. Go and look at the Stanford Encyclopedia article. If you don't believe me, go and ask ChatGPT what's first order logic, what's higher order logic, and it'll tell you exactly that. So I don't know why Jay uses the terms. Well, I guess he just doesn't know that they are terms in philosophy, because he's just he either doesn't care, like he's a bullshitter in the Frankfurt sense, or he doesn't know. But it can't be that he does know, and he's just using these terms in this wildly misleading way, right? So he either doesn't know or he doesn't care. Right? And I don't see how anyone could reach a different conclusion. And the only reason you wouldn't reach a different conclusion if you also didn't know or care. So, having established that he's often extremely badly behaved and a terrible role model for people, and doesn't definitely says stuff that's wrong, often it seems to me lies or just doesn't know what he's talking about. We'll move on. His favorite argument is the transcendental argument for God, which normally is associated with Protestants, Calvinists like Van Til or Banson or whatever. He's an Orthodox. It's a bit different, but so what? We've seen that in the last couple of weeks. Now, when I spoke to him, I tried to ask him what the form of the argument. When he's giving the argument, what's the form of the argument? And this was a typical thing. Van Til was also accused of never really giving the argument properly, never committing to any premises and a conclusion. And Jay also basically seems incapable of saying the argument in a straightforward manner. I asked him about it. You can go and watch Skeptical Agnostic, I believe is maybe I've got the name of your channel wrong, Stephen. I'm sorry if I had Skeptic Agnostic or Skeptical Agnostic. I can't remember. Whatever. He has a wonderful video, like an hour and a half, going through Jay Dyer's. I'll put that in the description afterwards as well, explaining this explaining in simple terms Jay Dyer's approach to tag as well. And he highlighted that in that discussion, I was going, so sorry, can you just say what the argument is, like premises and conclusion? And then Jay just meanders off down the potted history of philosophy again, and it's just like, where's this going? So he regularly doesn't give it in a premise conclusion form, and I think that's because he doesn't really get what's going on when someone asks him to do that. But also sometimes I think he kind of gestures towards having a form of the argument. And we'll see, I'm going to play a couple of clips of him trying to give the form of the argument and explaining why he's getting that wrong in different ways. So here we go. What's the form of the transcendental argument?
So here, and if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, when they give the example of transcendental arguments, this is the one that they always use. It's the one I used in the debate. You can go see that we've constantly pointed this out. Father Deacon Dr. Analyse's paper that we often direct people to, it just lays this out, right? Because it's the most easy way through disjunctive form to see what a transcendental argument is.
So he says X is a necessary condition for Y therefore X. But that's just modus ponens. That's just saying if Y then X, Y therefore X, right? So I don't know why he doesn't just say this is the most basic argument form that you find in logic, in propositional logic, in first order logic, whatever. It's like right at the core. A lot of the time you see logic given in a textbook or whatever, and it'll be axiomatized, and you'll have one rule of inference, and you sort of derive the rest of them from that, and it'll be modus ponens. And I don't know why he doesn't just say that, but the thought is that he doesn't realize that when he's saying that X is a necessary condition for Y, he's just saying if Y then X. That's what it means. That's what a necessary condition is in philosophy, in logic, in whatever. This is like the basic bit of content. So by having a big audience and being super confident and saying stuff like this, he's just misleading loads of people. It's like anti-education. He's just saying it wrong, not caring, never checking, say over and over again, right? He doesn't just say that once. It wasn't a careless slip of the tongue or something. And also he calls it a disjunctive, but a disjunction is an or statement. It's like A or B. That's a disjunction. And an A and B, in a disjunction, they're called disjuncts. So if you're saying something is disjunctive, you're saying it has that form. But saying that X is a necessary condition for Y is saying that it's an if-then form. So in an either-or form. I mean, like, in a sense, you can convert them if you want to, but, like, it's just the wrong word. It's a conditional. It's not a disjunction. And I don't know why he doesn't know that. I kind of think that the reason is that in the FDA paper that we looked at last time, and I think is the one that Dyer is referring to there, for some reason FDA gives 3 arguments, and one of them is a disjunction, and the other one is modus ponens. And I don't think and I explained before, they're not even logically equivalent, because there are different systems where you'll have one but you won't have the other. So I think he's just used the wrong word. I think he's just heard the word disjunction, doesn't really know what it means, and just uses it without caring really what it means. But it's wildly misleading, right? Here's another version of that.
Okay, so the form of tag is if X, then Y, right?
No.
Okay.
The form of the argument is X is a necessary condition of Y, Y, therefore X.
And see, it's how confidently the caller goes, I've been listening to your stuff, I think I know how this goes, right? Let me just see if I'm with you. The form of the argument is if X, then Y. And Jay's like, no. And then he just restates the same thing that he just shook his head and denied. Super confident, never curious about whether or not maybe someone's maybe right and he's wrong, just always dismissive in a kind of confident bro-like manner. But you know, all of us people who know like the most basic stuff about philosophy or logic or whatever, that's cringe. That's really laughable. One more on the form of tag, I think.
Is this like maybe some kind of IBE, or is this like a deductive argument to where if we say God doesn't exist, there's like a contradiction or something?
No, it's just a transcendental argument about the preconditions of logic, the preconditions of knowledge at all. So it's even more fundamental than that.
No, I'm understanding that. It's like a transcendental argument. Okay. But I'm asking what type of argument, like you can have like an inductive, abductive, deductive kinds of arguments. Like what kind of argument is this one?
It's a disjunctive. It's a disjunctive. X is a necessary condition of Y, Y therefore X.
A disjunctive, did you say? What do you mean disjunctive?
X is a necessary condition of Y, Y therefore X. That's the formal structure of what I'm arguing in the most simple formula.
Okay, that sounds deductive. I don't.
Whatever, dude.
The guy says, well, that sounds like it's deductive to me. And then Jay says, well, whatever. And then changes the subject, starts challenging him to bring his own argument. Also, I don't know why he's got his sunglasses on inside. Anyway, whatever. I guess we can park that. But, you know, there, he's saying it's not abductive, deductive, or inductive. And then he goes and gives modus ponens, which is like your poster, most basic bitch deductive argument. So it's like, do you not know what inductive, deductive, or abductive means either? And then he calls it, you know, disjunctive again. Oh, it's like Sideshow Bob stepping on the rake over and over again, that clip. It's just so bad. And yet this guy, like, is so patronizingly bro-like about his, like, you know, his grasp on logic, his grasp on philosophy. But it's like, it's cringe, and it's also difficult to watch. The next clip is we're gonna pivot away to something, a bit of a tangent, this one, but I wanted to bring this one in. just to preface this, Jay said a few weeks ago that he was stopping doing debates on whether God existed. And then I saw this video pop up, which is him doing a debate on whether God exists. So again, either he was talked back into it or what, I don't know. But he was certainly wrong about whether he was going to continue doing debates on whether God exists, because he carried on doing it. And the funny thing is, you'll actually see in the bottom corner is there's an advert for him doing another debate for God's existence a few days after this. So he's way back. He's back in the game now, doing debates and stuff. In a sense, this is a throwaway comment, but it was, and it's not really something that Jay talks about very much. But I wanted to bring this one in because I think now we're gonna escalate the depth a bit and stop picking on him for just sort of saying the logic word wrong, which I guess is kind of trivial and whatever. And like I wouldn't pick on him so much for this type of stuff if he was like a good-hearted, honest interlocutor. Given that he's such a dick, at the beginning he was, trying to emasculate T-Jump by lying about having a degree that he didn't have. And then he's, on that Piers Morgan thing, he acts like horrifically as well. So, if you're going to be like that in public and also claim to be, certainly act as if you're a very knowledgeable and authoritative philosophy bro, then it's only fair enough if like you don't know what validity means or what modus ponens is, that someone's going to call you out on that. And I think people have tried to say this stuff about pretty much nothing I've said so far is original, but I just want to highlight it as well if I'm doing a Jay Dyer video, basically. But yeah, here Jay Dyer talks about something about Nietzsche.
Abstract YT for 5 says, what are your thoughts on nihilism?
You can answer first.
I mean, as a Christian, obviously I'm not a nihilist. I do appreciate aspects of, say, Nietzsche's philosophy, and I think we can agree to some of those critiques of the weaknesses within Western civilization.
Really small clip, right? Bit of a throwaway one. And in a sense, who cares if he has this view about Nietzsche, but it exemplifies one of the sorts of things that Jay does, which is to just like very quickly name drop somebody and say something about what they said, but say it in a vague way so that you're not really sure what he's actually saying. It's really difficult to pin him down exactly on what he's, which bit of Nietzsche are you referring to, exactly what are you saying? And Nietzsche's kind of complicated, often misunderstood, kind of interesting philosopher in his own right, but like, what are you saying exactly? So he said, well, I'm not a nihilist because I'm a Christian, but of course sometimes I'm kind of sympathetic to some of the stuff that Nietzsche said. Nietzsche's a well-known critic of Christianity. So I was curious about this, and I was thinking, you know what, I've heard this before. Where have I heard this sort of view before? And I thought, oh yeah, I know I've heard this before.
All of us, whether we know it or not, are still coping with that consequence. Nietzsche knew, for example, that one of the consequences of that there would be 2 consequences of the death of God, and one would be the collapse of a system of meaning that encapsulated people psychologically and socially. The collapse of that system of meaning, Nietzsche believed, would bring about 2 events. One would be the dawn of a universal nihilism, right? A sense of rootlessness and hopelessness that would pervade Western culture and provide and result in an intense and pervasive demoralization. That and the dawn of the attraction of totalitarian ideologies that would rise to replace God.
Right, so I don't know if this is true at all, but I can definitely imagine that Jay's watched a bit of Jordan Peterson before. And maybe he's watched some of these Nietzsche lectures. After all, they're on YouTube and they're free, so maybe he has done. Even if he hasn't, Peterson's hardly a reliable Nietzsche interpreter himself, and maybe they're both getting this idea. It's kind of the generic misunderstanding of what Nietzsche's idea was. And it's basically something like that the idea, this is like the insane interpretation of historical figures from history, just like we saw with David Hume there, and how wrong Jay's idea was about what Hume was saying. I think the idea with this is it's supposed to be that Nietzsche says, oh, everything's going fine, blah, blah, blah. Oh, no, all of a sudden God's dead. We don't believe in him anymore. And that ushers in a crisis that he calls nihilism. Now we don't have this like basically fine system of values anymore. Because we don't believe in God. Now nihilism is on the stage. right? And as if like this is a kind of cozy Christian understanding of what Nietzsche's talking about, because the solution to that is seemingly, oh well, we better all believe in God again, because that's where we get rid of the nihilism and go back to, because he was saying as a Christian, I'm not a nihilist, but I'm sympathetic with some of the things that Nietzsche said, right? And you know, I'm going to play a bit of the YouTube channel The Essentialists, because this guy's a wonderful, wonderful Nietzsche interpreter as far as I'm concerned, and he can say this much better than I can. So let me just play this clip.
It's very funny because he presents nihilism as a consequence of the death of God. But the death of God, in some sense, is a consequence of nihilism. Where does nihilism come from for Nietzsche? It's exactly what I described. It's a religion that puts all the value for our lives in a world beyond, in an other world, and essentially says that, you know, this world, it's a sin-cursed world, it's a fallen world, it's all going to be burned away after the day of judgment anyway. And all of your vain glory, all of your pursuits of your desires for your own selfish ambitions, or for aesthetic pleasures, or even for your, even fulfilling your base impulsive desires, that's all sinful. Everything human beings do in some sense is sinful. We're originally sinful. We're stained with sin. And Nietzsche says that this attitude in which the good life becomes impossible in this world, and in which the true world is accessible only after death, produces, and then not only that, but the ascetic ideal that we already mentioned, right? The whole starving of the impulses of the ascetic as the ideal type. This all leads us to, that's what produces the crisis of nihilism. Nihilism comes out of Christianity. It's not we lose Christianity and then therefore we have to confront nihilism because our values have been questioned, and the only thing that was holding this all together was these certain axiomatic principles that we had, and our values, now that they've become questionable, that's what produces the nihilism. It's like, oh, nothing matters because Christianity turned out to be untrue. No, yeah, I understand the argument, but that's not actually what Nietzsche's arguing. Is the very interesting thing. He's saying part of why Christianity has to die is because it's created a nihilistic approach to life. He calls Christianity a kind of disguised nihilism.
Right. See, so what I don't understand is that Jay's saying, well, yeah, I kind of am sympathetic to some of Nietzsche's critiques about Western civilization. Sorry, the main essential thing that Nietzsche was arguing about was how Christianity, you know, inverts the kind of will of people, and it causes ressentiment or whatever, and that breeds nihilism. Christianity is the cause of nihilism in the modern world. That's Nietzsche's central thesis. Which bit of that does Jay agree with? Right? None of it. He just doesn't understand it, because I doubt he's ever really made a genuine attempt to engage with what Nietzsche said. I think he's just happy to chuck around well-tired, often repeated memes about what Nietzsche says. He doesn't actually know anything about that. Just like he's not interested in what David Hume actually said. He just says stuff about what David Hume says. So anyway, it's a tangent. It's not like Jay ever really riffs on Nietzsche, but it's just, you know, I could have picked a dozen different things. It was just that one in particular I found funny because it made me think of Peterson and the essentialist critique on that. So I guess for the rest of the time, however long this is going to take, let's think about what Jay's transcendental argument. And what I'm going to do is go through some things. I mean, maybe this isn't as organized as it could be, but at the end, I'm just going to play without any clips or anything, just the first, say, 15 minutes or so of the best Jay Dyer video that I found. And I've listened to a ton over the last month or so. I've been walking, when I walk my dog, I put YouTube on and I subject myself to listening to Jay Dyer sessions. And there's so much of it. He's been doing YouTube for so long. And there's all these clips channels that you can fully immerse yourself in Jay Dyer, and I believe I found the best bit of Jay Dyer, and actually it's not him doing a debate. My view is that Jay Dyer's at his worst when he's debating. He's actually a terrible debater, would be my view, because he doesn't have very good listening skills. right? He doesn't actually, as of the clips I've played, he's often just talking over the opponent. He's not really listening. He's not thinking about what. He doesn't give them any time to say what they want to say, and yeah, that makes him a debater, because there's not really much back and forth. It's often just him waiting to hear the keyword that triggers him into the thing that he wants to say anyway. And if you want to hear the best of Jay Dyer, what you should do is listen to the bits where he's taking questions from members of his community or whatever on YouTube or whatever the platform is that he's streaming on, and it just explaining himself without the pressure of being the big aggressive alpha bro whatever. And that's where you can really, I think, you cut out the silly the games and the kind of the silliness stuff, and you kind of begin to get an idea of what his idea actually is. And I think at the end I'll just sort of spend as long as necessary getting into the detail of that, and I want to build up to that. Now, I've played some clips. I have more clips, and maybe if it's fun later on, we can do some more of them. We didn't look at the trivia list one yet. That's funny. There's a couple of others, so if needs be, we can look at them. But let's just think about what's going on with Jay Dyer. So the basic idea is he's trying to say something like the general idea is that there's some critique of normally empiricists / materialists, runs those two things together. He references David Hume a lot, and he thinks about it as this kind of like malaise of modernity, that these days modern philosophy doesn't do metaphysics anymore, not like back in the old days when they did metaphysics properly. Nowadays it's just it's all kind of epistemology, and it's like sort of rootless and it can't escape this kind of empiricist kind of straitjacket that it's stuck in. What he thinks it's doing is it's leaving the practitioner of this empiricism of atheism stuck in a shallow, superficial understanding of the world. And what he's trying to encourage them to do is to see that actually a lot of the things that they want to say, like, science works and it allows us to know about the world or whatever, only that those types of things are not really expressible if from that vantage point of empiricism or materialism or whatever. And that in fact, not just that worldview is impoverished, but that the person trying to put that forwards is themselves in fact committed to a much broader, wider picture that goes beyond empiricism. So this is where presuppositionalism comes in. So he thinks that the person who wants to say something like the Bible is false, something like that, that they can't just make that type of criticism from the vantage point of empiricism, because that doesn't allow them to say that the self exists, or that, like, there are causal relations, or the future will be like the past, or space and time, blah 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 blah. These things are all not empirically verifiable. That's Jay's idea, and the empiricist is sort of presupposing those, while at the same time, if you ask him whether that he can actually know that those things exist, he'll say that he can't know that those exist, but he's presupposing that they do exist, even when he's denying that he can know that they exist. And that's a kind of central tension that Jay wants to bring out in his interlocutor, and say that that's what defeats their worldview, is the way he would put it, or it makes knowledge impossible from their point of view. And it's a clash between their presuppositions and the things that they say out loud, or the kind of epistemology that they espouse explicitly. And we'll see later on when we play the clip of Jay where he's being calm and articulate, that he lays it out in terms of like level, I think it's level 2 he calls it, which is basically, he often talks about the reports of sense data, those types of scientific claims, and then level 1 is like these transcendental objects, those are the sort of things I was just talking about, the self and causality, that type of thing. And then level 0 is like God at the top. So he's saying that you have to have these scientific statements, you have to presuppose these transcendental things, but then the transcendental things themselves, you have to presuppose that God exists. Now, the way I see it is that the transition from this sort of surface level empiricist statements to the background like objects of knowledge that Jay thinks we're all presupposing the method there that Jay wants to use is he's calling it this transcendental method. And often he says he'll refer to it being that like it makes knowledge impossible for that person, or that they by trying to deny it, they're in fact presupposing it. And that method is a bit wishy-washy, and I'm going to try and unpick some problems with like what exactly it is his method is supposed to be there, and how are we supposed to understand what that is. And then I think that the movement from the transcendental objects to God, it can't be the same, or however you cash out what the method is supposed to be, from the kind of empirical to the transcendental, from the transcendental to the divine, can't be the same type of method. And I think at that point it really is just an inference to the best explanation. And the caller in that previous clip who said, isn't this just an IBE? Jay should say, yeah, it is at that point, because it's very implausible that the transcendental method that he's talking about, that goes from the empirical to the transcendental, could really ever take you from the transcendental to the divine. It just seems like that, and I'll explain that more, but I really do think that that's not going to work. So there's a couple of like historical candidates for what the method is that he's invoking, because he's using the term transcendental. And typically when you say that word in philosophy, most people will think that you're talking about something to do with Kant, and that's because Immanuel Kant basically coined the term and uses it in the Critique of Pure Reason. And so I'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah, actually, maybe I'll talk about that now. So I think that like, if Jay says he'll say stuff like, oh, Kant had some good ideas, a couple of good points that Kant made, but I disagree with him. And I think the idea is supposed to be there's something like a general endorsement of the methodology, but there's a rejection of the kind of conceptual nature of where Kant's project leaves him, right? So the general thumbnail sketch, I don't want to do a potted history, but you kind of have to a little bit when you're rehearsing what Jay says, is that Hume comes along and says something like I'm already doing. Hume comes along and says, Hume's idea is something like, if you're a strict empiricist about stuff, then you shouldn't, like, his analysis of causation can't really see the causes. Or I can see, this billiard ball and then that billiard ball moving or whatever, but like, where's this thing you call a cause, right? I just see stuff moving about. Causes are types of things that rationalists were postulating necessary connections between events or whatever. He says it's kind of hidden behind the sensations, and they may not be there. Maybe they're there, or maybe they're not. But from the point of view of like empiricism, best you can do is something else. So his analysis of causation is something like you just become habituated to expect that when stuff of this type happens, stuff of that type follows. So Hume's got this kind of reductive account of what causation is, and it's basically just what you could have if only you're staying strict to your empiricism and not postulating stuff that you can't really detect empirically yourself. Or his analysis of morality is rooted in the kind of your desires and your emotions and stuff like that. So again, it's something that you've got access to, and it's like a reductive account. So you're not postulating like moral values existing out there in the world. You tell some other type of story about it that's okay for an empiricist. But it's kind of a threat if you think that there are if you want to be able to do science and like talk about things in the objective world out there beyond your senses or whatever, you might feel threatened by Hume's empiricism, and this is kind of Kant's Kickstarter. He's trying to respond to Hume in some sense, right? This typical story, and he wants to say that there's synthetic a priori knowledge, right? Something I can know with my mind for certain, but it's also not just a kind of trivial definitional thing. It's something about something that's real that actually exists, right? Synthetic, not just analytic. So then Kant has his like transcendental deduction, right? And the way it works is it's kind of like, and this is very quick, and I'm not a Kant scholar, so like take this with a pinch of salt. This is the sort of thing you never hear Jay say, is I'm not a such and such scholar. He comes across super confident by everything that he says, right? But my understanding of it it works like this. You start off by seeing, well, I've got these sensations, right? Like sensation of color over here and a temperature over there and like a whatever these bare sense data, so Jay's favorite phrase. And, this kind of Cartesian skeptic will be like on your shoulder going, well, maybe that's all there is, right? How do you know that there's a real world behind that sense data? Maybe you're just the only thing that exists. And as I see it, part of the transcendental method is to start from premises that the skeptic will agree to. So Kant says something about how, well, it's not just sensations, right? You've got an experience that's unified, that's like coherent. It's not just, brown and circle and, shiny and cold, or whatever, just like random and jumbled up or something. They kind of are part of a network that's connected together, that presents things to you. Brown dog, right? Open window, cold air, stuff like this. It's like it's all mushed together in a synthesized kind of coherent whole. And for that to be and so the skeptic's going to agree, yeah, okay, well, I'm saying that you've got this idea, it's not just like brown and circle and whatever, it's a dog and a guitar and stuff, but maybe there's nothing behind that. That's the kind of Cartesian worry. But Kant thinks, well, if you'll allow me the notion that the bare sensations must be synthesized together into a unified whole, then Kant's next move is to say, well, there's something must be synthesizing them, right? There must be some activity of the mind that's like stitching together the bare inputs of sense data and turning them into concepts and ideas that you can understand and like experience as meaningful things, right? The intelligibility of experience. Well, what's doing the job of synthesizing the experiences together, of stitching it together? It can only be some kind of mental faculty that's doing that, that's driving it. And Kant thinks that the mental faculty is a kind of faculty of the understanding. What's that? Well, he says it must be these kind of like basically what he calls logical functions, right? The brain operating in a kind of broadly logical way, stitching these things together a bit like a machine. And what does that mean? Well, for Kant has this kind of stepping on a rake moment in the beginning of the Critique, where he says that logic was completed by Aristotle. Right? It's taken not one step forwards and not one step back since the days of Aristotle. And it's really unfortunate because Kant's sort of just before the advent of the kind of big revolution in logic, where that all changed and people now realize that logic wasn't completed by Aristotle at all. But basically Kant thinks, oh, here's logic. I know what logic is. Picks up, prior analytics or whatever, and reads Aristotle and goes, oh, it is the basic form of a proposition is, subject predicate form. All A's are B, something like that, right? And he basically just superimposes the Aristotelian logical system and thinks that must be the basic machinery that the brain is using, that the mind is using to stitch together sense data to turn it into coherent rational thought. And then it's like another bit of a waffly, bit of a hand wavy jump to then say, now we've got these Aristotelian categories, right? The categories that Jay loves to talk about from metaphysics. But obviously when Kant's talking about them, he thinks that they're like being imposed by the mind. So they're like conceptual things, right? They're basically the same as the Aristotelian categories, but they're like not out there in the world. They're like parts of my mind, right? Now, why am I taking this detour into explaining what Kant's talking about? Well, it's to suppose, what I'm trying to say is that it's not just that like Jay can agree with a bit of this methodology and then reject that right at the end, it somehow pops out at the other end that Kant makes a mistake and then somehow they're just concluding that this is all conceptual. It's conceptual from the beginning, right? It's a fundamentally conceptual project. It's about how your sensations are stitched together. How is it possible for my sensations to be coherent? That's Kant's project. And he gets to it by going up from the sensations so far and then down from the Aristotelian categories, and he meets in the middle, and that's what you've probably all heard that Kant's idea is that you impose the forms of intuition on your sensation, whatever. That's just what's going on, is marrying these two things together. So it can't be that Jay's using this method. Why is that? It's for one thing, is that Jay regularly dismisses Kant's conceptual aspect of Kant's transcendental method. But it's also that, like, if you think about it, Jay's trying. I mean, here's a distinction for you, right? The difference between a modest transcendental argument and an ambitious transcendental argument, right? A modest transcendental argument will be saying, for X to be the case, whatever that is, let's say for my experience to be coherent, then Y must be the case, right? What's Y in this circumstance? Well, for Kant, the Y is something like my mind must work in a certain way, right? So the conclusion of Kant's argument is that for me to have intelligible experience, something about my mind must be the case, right? So it's something internal you start with, and the conclusion is something internal as well. An ambitious transcendental argument starts with the same beginning, for me to have intelligible experience, but then something must be the case. But the thing that must be the case isn't something in my mind, it's something outside my mind, in the world, right? That God exists, or that, you know, the future really will resemble the past, or that the self actually does exist, or that, you know, space and time actually exist. So Jay's doing an ambitious transcendental argument. He wants to show that the transcendental objects are actually there in the world, that when we have to presuppose them, and they're really there. Not that I have to presuppose them, but that might just be a construct of my mind, a constraint of my mind. He's doing an ambitious ontological argument, transcendental argument. So it can't be that what Jay's doing is anything like what Kant's doing. He can use the word transcendental, and he uses, unlike Kant, as far as I remember, the word presuppose or presupposition. But that's basically it. It's got nothing else to do with what Kant's doing. So you can sort of like, well, obviously there must be some relation to what Kant's doing. Jay eschews Kant in some respects, but it seems to me, doesn't really understand how radically what he's saying departs from what Kant must be saying. So I think it's another occasion where Jay can't be using what Kant's method is. Now, if it's not Kant, the other kind of typical thing you hear in this, in these circles, let's say, I mean, in modern day, you'll think of someone like Strawson, but I never hear Jay talking about Strawson. What Jay will often say, and I'll play a clip about this in a minute, is he'll reference Aristotle, because Aristotle has some kind of argument in the Metaphysics, book 4 of the Metaphysics, where he talks about the law of non-contradiction. We've talked about this on the channel before, and we've had Graham Priest on the channel and talk to us about it as well. But supposedly there's this transcendental argument in Aristotle, right? And Jay actually references, yeah, this is the type of argument that I'm doing. And now when I spoke to Jay, I think pretty much the only interesting bit of it for me was when we talked about this, where, you know, I've spent quite a lot of time reading quite a lot of the secondary literature on this. I'm someone who tends towards becoming obsessed with things every now and again, as you may have noticed. And that was one of the things I became obsessed with. And I read, you know, the crucial bits of Aristotle, a bunch of the secondary literature, and found my way into, you know, we talked about Yukasevich and Graham Priest's critiques on them, which is where I land on it these days. So for me, it was a fun opportunity to talk about something that I've spent ages thinking about and reading about in the past, and it's very obscure, and it's not something you can easily find people who want to talk about it with you that much. But I do understand that, like, a lot of people think that it was disappointing because we got sidetracked into just talking about Aristotle instead of about Tag. But actually, it seems to me that it's quite crucial to Tag because, you know, if it's not Kant that we're talking about, if what Jay's doing isn't Kantian transcendental arguments, what exactly is it that he's doing? And the only other thing that seems plausible, the thing that he references, is Aristotle. And it's a fun combination of that must be what he's got in mind, but also it's really easy to show how bad that argument is. So I'm going to do both of those things now. Let's play a bit of. So here's Jay talking after our debate, where he references what I was saying. So I was bringing up there's a controversy in reading Aristotle's passage. There's a sequence of passages in that bit of the Metaphysics, the long argument, and then a bunch of short ones that come after it. And commentators, modern commentators, ones who are actually critical about Aristotle, are stuck really because it's kind of like a riddle about how you understand it, right? Because Aristotle says at the beginning when it comes to the law of non-contradiction, you can't give a direct argument to show that the law of non-contradiction is true. You have to give an indirect argument, right? What's an indirect argument? Where did that come from? So it's not clear what an indirect argument is, but then what he goes on to give, if like one way of reading it, just obviously it's a direct argument, right? It basically just becomes modus ponens or modus tollens possibly. But if that's what, how could it be that he's on the one hand saying it's not a direct argument, but then giving an obviously direct argument for it, right? So there's this kind of riddle of understanding what's going on there. But then also if you think, oh, well, fuck it, who cares? It just is, that is what his argument is. Then on the next level, if you think about like, well, what is the argument any good? No, it seems like a terrible argument. There's a really like straightforward critique of what, like, if that is what he's saying, it can't be right, can it? It can't be a good argument, because if it was that, then here's the problem, right? So we'll go into that in a minute, but then that's just to set up the context. Is I was saying, there's this exegetical and interpretational controversy about that bit of Aristotle. So it can't be that you're just saying, yeah, that's what I think is this basic reading of Aristotle, completely unaware of the controversy around it. But I think Jay didn't have any awareness of there being any controversy. Anyway, so he's had some time to think about it by the time I play this next clip. And he's got something he wants to say back. And, oh, actually, I wonder if I seem to be missing clip 10. Oh, that's annoying. Let me just see if I can... No, I knew there'd be something wrong here. Just give me 2 seconds. I'm going to just grab clip 10. If I can find it. Talk amongst yourselves. God damn, I was on a roll for a moment. Oh, balls. I might just have to get the video up. Can't find the clip. Oh, and actually, whilst I'm doing this, let me just say it was really helpful that loads of people responded to my post by giving me ideas of things to use in this video, because a lot of that was very, very useful for me, and that's where I got some of these clips from. And this is one of them. I'd completely forgotten about this, but somebody posted, and I'll be able to see who it was in just a second, to remind me of this bit where they said, oh, do you remember when Jay responded to your comments on Aristotle? And so... that was, I hate why his YouTube names are always so difficult to pronounce when you say Alejandro Cerveto 2206. I hope I've said that correctly. So I'm watching it on my non-premium account. Let's get through this advert. Non-skippable YouTube adverts. Unacceptable. And last one, for fuck's sake. Right, fucking hell, that was annoying. Let me share my screen. Okay, here is, I think it starts maybe a minute before that.
I don't want people to get the wrong impression that, for example, if you're making a transcendental argument, that you're stuck in some sort of a priori world.
Idealism, yeah.
Because that's not at all what it is. Because actually a big part of the transcendental argument being holistic, it requires experience of this world. It necessitates, it assumes experience of this world, namely the world that we inhabit, not some other theoretical one or whatever, like JF was thinking. But it assumes this world, and it assumes, you know, categories that are applicable to the here and the now. That's another misunderstanding that people have, because a lot of times people hear the argument, they hear what we're talking about. Some of the atheists that I've argued, and they're like, oh, well, you're just talking about like Kant's transcendental idealism, and that doesn't have anything to do with the here and the now. And that's not actually true, because transcendental arguments have a life of their own outside of Kant. They've had a life outside of that, and they're just a different type of reasoning and logic. They're not invalid, but they're different, and that's what I think trips a lot of people up. But we're not yet. I'm sorry, we're not to transcendental arguments. Okay, so basically with the classical foundationalist tradition, what we're doing is we're starting with those kind of self-evident maxims, and I think it's appropriate to say that. Would you agree that because a lot of the ancient world didn't think in terms of meta level questions? I'm not talking about generically the idea of metaphysics, but meta logic, meta ethics, meta mathematics, questions about language that would only say pop up after Vico, you know, people like that, Giambattista Vico. So they didn't think about it like that, but we do have that transcendental argument statement from the Fount of Knowledge, where I believe, and I think that if you got to hear the debate that I did with Dr. Malpass, who works in epistemology as well, he was...
I don't actually work in epistemology, so I work in metaphysics, but never mind.
Was making the case that nobody really thought that Aristotle was making a transcendental kind of argument in Metaphysics Book 7, but I think that
Metaphysics Book 4, never mind.
The fact that John Damascus in the Fount is relying on Aristotle so heavily in that book, the fact that he begins the book with that transcendental argument about how philosophy assumes a worldview and assumes logic, and if you were to be a sophist and deny it, that's the argument that Aristotle gives against the sophists. So point being is that I think Dr. Malpass was wrong to say that it's not a transcendental argument, and nobody after Aristotle in the ancient world thought that it was, because I don't think he's read John Damascus. But what would you say to somebody who says, for example, well, these arguments...
All right, that's probably enough of that bit of Jay. It's just enough to show that, like, there's controversy about like the form of Aristotle's argument, and I wasn't saying that the people in the ancient world were aware or really going through that very much, because in the ancient and medieval periods, people are not very critical of Aristotle. They like reading Aristotle, but they're not like applying academic critical methods to it very much. They kind of just revere Aristotle. Yeah, okay, fine. I'm not really interested in that. I'm talking about like the modern day scholarship on that part of Aristotle, so 20th century and onwards kind of scholarship on that. And if there's controversy about whether or not we should classify what Aristotle was doing as a transcendental argument, that question doesn't even make sense before Kant, because Kant's the person who comes up with that method. And then there's this question of, was Aristotle actually anticipating what Kant did? But there's no way John of Damascus could have weighed in on that question, because he's like, whatever, 8th century or whatever it is that he, you know, I don't exactly, 6th century, something like that. Anyway, whatever, he's like 1,000 years before Kant. So there's no way that he could possibly have known or been able to weigh in on the question of whether or not Aristotle's methodology was the same as Kant's, right? But anyway, I went and had a look at the Font of Knowledge, and there is no discussion of Aristotle's argument in Metaphysics 4 there at all. There is, I think, what Jay's talking about. There's an argument that looks like it's like Aristotle's argument in Protrepticus, which is a lost book of Aristotle, where where apparently what's going on there is Aristotle's trying to give an argument for why you should do philosophy. And then the argument is something like, if you think that you shouldn't do philosophy, then you've got to have some like reasons for why not. And at that point, you're basically doing philosophy. So that means that you don't think that you shouldn't do philosophy because you're already doing it. Is that a transcendental argument? I mean, maybe sort of. It's kind of there's something kind of like sort of self-referential or something about that. It looks like it's something to do with presuppositions, maybe. But that's basically the argument that John of Damascus gives. It's got nothing to do with the law of non-contradiction. The the way Jay describes it is something like that John of Damascus says, well, you've got to have a worldview in order to do philosophy or whatever. That's completely not right at all. I mean, you should think he would get one of his own patristic fathers' arguments right. So, prove me wrong, show me in the comments if John of Damascus gives an analysis of Metaphysics Book 4 or says anything about transcendental arguments or says anything about the law of non-contradiction. What he does is, broadly speaking, just repeat, like they all did in those days, stuff from Aristotle. So he just basically regurgitates Aristotelian logic and metaphysics, but he's not engaging with it critically, and he's not doing anything apart from maybe that bit of the argument where it could sort of maybe be thought of as transcendental method. There's nothing else there. So Jay's, again, is just like hazy misremembering of what somebody else said. But he did slip into one of the things he often says, which is about this was Aristotle's argument when he was arguing with the sophists, right? So Jay can sort of remember that in the Metaphysics, he sort of, characteristically Aristotle portrays the people he's arguing against in really unflattering and non-charitable ways, right? And so he characterizes other people as Heraclitans, for instance, as being committed to the contradictions all the time because everything is in flux or whatever. Whether they really were as committed to that doctrine as he says they were, whatever, who knows? But he seems to remember Aristotle arguing with the sophists as if they were saying. I don't remember it being that the sophists were saying something about contradictions being true. I thought it was the Heraclitans, but whatever. His idea is that, he has this little monologue about it, but here he leans on his friend FDA to unpack that a bit, and I thought that actually FDA says it in this bit better than Jay did, and I actually got this clip, so let me just play this bit.
I'd say that absolutely is a species of the transcendental argument. So, for example, you could use this, the three basic fundamental laws of thought, the law of identity, the law of exclude the middle, and the law of non-contradiction. What Aristotle's saying is that these fundamental laws are assumed in doing anything. It's assumed in making arguments, it's assumed in language, it's assumed for meaning. And in order for you to deny that the three fundamental laws of thought exist, guess what? You have to assume them. So, for example, what laws are you referring to? By the three fundamental laws, do you mean the three fundamental laws of thought? Check. You just assumed the law of identity. And by the three fundamental laws of thought, it's either the three fundamental laws of thought or it isn't? Yes. Then you've got law of exclude the middle. So it couldn't be that we're in this conversation talking about the three fundamental laws of thought and not the three fundamental laws of thought at the same time and in the same way. Yes. Then again, you've shown that you've assumed the law of non-contradiction. So in other words, in order to deny that, you have to assume it to deny it, which is self-stultifying.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, the Latins will know this, but stultifying from the Latin stultus, stupid. You made yourself stupid, right? By contradicting yourself. That is a transcendental argument. And that's exactly the sort of argument that we would make too, is that in order to deny the existence of God, you have to you're presupposing it, whether you consciously recognize that or not, as a foundation to deny it in the exact same way as you point out, Jay, that Aristotle illustrates. And therefore, it's a type of transcendental argument.
Right.
So there, very clearly, you can see that they both nod along and, oh yes, that's right, definitely. Where FDA says this is exactly the sort of argument that we would use to show that God exists, and that who cares whether we call it a transcendental argument or not? But that is the type of argument. They both say yes, definitely, that's what we would say. We would argue in the same way that Aristotle would. And what the argument is supposed to be, obviously, is, as he said, if you say anything at all, that will presuppose the law of non-contradiction or that the laws of logic are true. But it's just that, it's really they don't ever sit there and never read anyone critical of that view, or seemingly ever ask themselves, critique their own ideas. Is this really good? Is it actually a good argument, or have I just heard it before and I'm just saying it? Because okay, here's a standard way of like undermining this. Suppose you do find somebody who's claiming that the law of non-contradiction isn't true. Right? They're going to fall into two groups, right? They're either going to be a dialetheist or they're going to be a trivialist. This is why trivialism should be interesting to Jane, and seemingly never heard of it before. Actually, I had a funny clip of that, but I'm not sure I uploaded it in time. But anyway, whatever. From the video on trivialism, right, where the guy phones in and starts running some stuff about trivialism, and Jay says, "Oh, I've heard of this before. Yeah, definitely." And then a few minutes later, the guy says, "Do you actually know what trivialism is?" And Jay goes, "No, I don't know what it is." Right? Which is kind of a shame, because if you're going to run Aristotle's argument, you should know what trivialism is, right? For this reason. So someone who comes along and challenges you, I think the law of non-contradiction is false. You're going to fall into one or two groups. Either they're going to be a trivialist or they're going to be a dialetheist. What does that mean? Right? The difference is just, if you're a dialetheist, you think some contradiction is true, but not all contradictions are true, right? Some, but not all. Whereas the trivialist thinks that all contradictions are true. The trivialist thinks that every proposition is true, which just then means every contradiction is true as well, right? Because that's just a subset of all of the propositions. But the dialetheist is going to say something is contradictory, but not everything. So they might say something like, Graham Priest is a good example of this type of person, or you might find examples from history too. I mean, Priest thinks Hegel was a dialetheist in some sense, or Nagarjuna was a dialetheist, whatever. But you find people sometimes entertaining this sort of heretical seeming notion that there might be contradictions kind of on the edges of reality or whatever. And you might think that within the concept of nothingness is contradictory, or the concept of being is contradictory, or something like that. Or, straightforward example, you might think that the liar paradox is an example of a true contradiction. Now, if you do think that there's something like that, you better not also think that from a contradiction anything follows, because that just leads you straight into trivialism, right? So if you want to not be a trivialist, but still think that some proposition is contradictory, what you have to do is deny that everything follows from it. Okay, so you need to adopt what's called paraconsistency. That's just the definition of paraconsistency. You think there's some, you just think that it's not the case that from a contradiction everything follows. So, okay, that's the distinction between a dialetheist and a trivialist, right? But now, how does this Aristotle's argument work? So imagine we run the sort of thing that FDA was just saying then, that if they say, I think that the liar paradox is a true contradiction, he's going to say, do you think that the liar paradox is a true contradiction, and it's not also the case that the liar paradox isn't a true contradiction? And the dialetheist is probably going to say, yeah, I think that the statement that the liar paradox is a true contradiction isn't itself a contradiction. It's just that the liar paradox is true and false. My statement that it's true or false is consistent. So they're not presupposing the law of non-contradiction. They're saying a consistent sentence. But they can do that even though they think there's some true contradiction. So strictly speaking, they think the law that says there's no contradictions is false, because there's an exception to it. So they're not presupposing that the law of non-contradiction, just saying something consistent doesn't mean that you think that the law that says everything is consistent is true, right? If I bump into someone and they're French, that doesn't mean I think everybody is French, right? I can think this guy is French even though not everyone is French, right? I can say this sentence is consistent even if I think not every sentence is consistent. So it's just a blatant non sequitur to say, I've got this person to commit to something being consistent, therefore they're presupposing the law of non-contradiction. No, they're not. Right? The dialetheist is well within his rights to say, I'm not presupposing the law of non-contradiction. You haven't shown that just by getting me to commit to something being consistent. So it obviously doesn't work against the dialetheist. It's a terrible argument if you really did have like the sophist in Jay's imagination who's acting like a dialetheist. He's well within their rights not to be moved by Aristotle's argument. What about the trivialist? Well, trivialist just agrees with everything you say. So you say, do you agree trivialism is true and not false? Yeah. Do you agree that it's both true and false? Yeah. Whatever you say to them, they're going to agree with. So, can you even win an argument against them? Is there any sense in which you can, they'll concede immediately that what they've said is contradictory. They'll concede to anything you ask them. right? So I think that they just like escape the net of rationality whatsoever. Like there's no winning an argument against them. There's no proving a point against them. You concede everything you want to say immediately if you just ask them to. So can you have a good argument that really shows anything against a trivialist? I just don't think you can. But who cares? Nobody's a trivialist anyway. But Jay should understand the difference between a trivialist and a dialetheist. A dialetheist at least is a, position that someone might have in philosophy. Certainly since the sort of second half of the 20th century, where there's understanding of how paraconsistent logic works. So it's just sort of like lame and cringe and out of date and bad philosophy to think that, if what Aristotle was doing is just sneakily getting your opponent to commit to something being true and not false, and then saying, well, you must be committed to the law of non-contradiction as a consequence. That's just a terrible, terrible argument, and nobody should make it. So if that, it can't be what Kant's saying, it can't be what is what Jay's up to. If what he's up to, like they seem to be saying emphatically on that argument, is on that video, is that they're doing what Aristotle does, well, there's a terrible argument, and what they're doing is a terrible argument then, if it's modelling what Aristotle was doing. But like the sort of wider point is that you can say to somebody, you say X, that presupposes Y, but that doesn't mean that it does, right? You actually have to do some more work to show that it actually does. And Aristotle's arguments fail to establish that. So it is possible to make the claim X presupposes Y, try and give an argument that supports that, and it not work, right? Aristotle's blatantly fails. It's a terrible argument. Jay and FDA seemingly don't understand that, can't tell, I guess don't know anything about the kind of standard dialetheist objection to that. Never read Yukasevich's book and never read anything by Graham Priest or all the other people who've done work on dialetheism and paraconsistency. So that just leads me as a preamble really to think, well, how is it that Jay's arguing for what he's arguing for? And it seems to me that the methodology is unclear. Now let's play a bit of what I think is the best Jay Dyer video, where we can see him explaining it in his own terms without the bravado or whatever, without FDA coming in and saying it in his way. So I'm going to play this video, which I'll put in the description as well. I'm just going to start playing it. Unlike, it's not really a clip this, I've just downloaded the whole video. So it's him not talking to I guess it's a caller in a sense, but it's like not an antagonistic atheist debate me bro kind of situation. It's almost like I could imagine it being a sort of Patreon only guest thing. Is it going to play? God damn it, why aren't you playing, motherfucker? Okay.
Phenomenal observation or whatever is the common way that we're usually speaking about facts or phenomena in the world. And the thing about these types of things is that in this domain, we're typically not involved in circularity, right? So if we were in a courtroom setting, this is where the courtroom setting would fail, right? Because if we were in a courtroom setting and we were saying, we were arguing, did Bill Cosby, does he live next door to me, right? And then we go and we check and we find out, no, in fact, Bill Cosby did not live next door to me. And in fact, that it was Eddie Murphy. You thought that I was going to say Lil Wayne because of my dumb analogy, but no, it was in fact Eddie Murphy. Now, if I'm wrong about that empirical sense data fact, does that destroy my worldview? Hello?
No, it doesn't.
Right. So it's just kind of like it's a thing that I could be wrong about that doesn't significantly alter my perception of reality, my ethics, right? It's in this domain of what we could call level 2 types of things. Now, in this domain up here of level 1, I'm just making this up on the spot as an illustration. This is where we're raising the bar, right? We're going to say, no, those are one types of, or a class of statements about things that can be wrong. What about reasoning itself? And so these are meta-logical questions, meta-ethical questions, meta-physical questions. When I start to ask questions in that domain, and I ask questions about reasoning itself, or words themselves? How do we know words have meaning? How do we know logic is logical? You see, these are questions that you can't actually be wrong about. Because if you're wrong about that domain, it really destroys the possibility of knowledge, right? So things like transcendental categories, things like fundamental presuppositions kind of go in this domain of what we're going to call level 1, right? And the level 1 is what undergirds things in level 2. So we'll put things like categories, like Aristotle's categories, or presuppositions, not any presupposition, but presuppositions about the possibility of knowledge. So this would be, space, time, objective reality, objective principles, logic, numbers, abstract entities, the future resembling the past, induction, identity over time, all these kinds of things that we call presuppositional categories. That words have meaning, that's an easy one to do. Or that logic is logical, right? I mean, in other words, doesn't it kind of presuppose that words have meaning? Sure. So, but how do we know words have meaning? Well, can you demonstrate that without using words? No. So it's circular. It's an unavoidable circularity. So the thing with the categories, the presuppositions, or something like words have meaning, there's no way to argue or demonstrate or show that the things in level 1 that undergird level 2, right, that they're true without circularity. It's impossible. There's no way to demonstrate logical categories of being, metaphysics, the presuppositions of, things that I mentioned earlier, or that words have meaning without in some way being circular or referencing the thing that you're trying to prove. It's just impossible, right? Again, how do we know logic is logical? Well, there's no way to argue about that or speak about that without assuming logic and principles of logic. So that's the type of circularity that we're talking about. Now, typically in the domain of debate, most people, especially atheists, they don't really think in these two levels. They think everything is like this. Literally everything up here is also just in this category. And they don't understand that presuppositional argumentation or thought is unique and different, because it shows that these things on the top in level 1, they're actually preconditions for the possibility of knowledge. Okay? So they're not just knowledge claims. They're things that are necessary to have knowledge at all. So it's unavoidable that there's circularity here, right? For example, how do we know logic is logical? Well, this is the classic response of Aristotle to the sophists. It's repeated by John of Damascus in Fount of Knowledge at the very beginning, where he says that, well, if you deny that logic is logical, you're using logic to deny logic, and that's a contradiction. It's self-refuting. So in other words, it's impossible. You can't do it. Logic is self-referencing, as are other sort of assumed categories for the possibility of knowledge and meaning and predication. Okay? So that's how our conception of predication, metaphysics, epistemology works. And in day-to-day parlance, or in a literal courtroom setting where we're investigating a murder or a crime or something like that, everything is taking place at this level. Really, it's only philosophers, theologians, and metaphysicians who are asking questions at this level. Pretty much no one else is. Science, totally in this domain, right? Science is 99.99999% of the time not in this domain, right? The only time I could think of a scientist being in this domain would be like if you counted, like a mathematician as a scientist, and there was some weird like math thing going on that applied to like computer science or something like that. In that case, maybe you could find a mathematician who's doing stuff at this level, Cantor or a Gödel. That would kind of count as this kind of a thing. But almost always, all math and science, empirical observation stuff is happening here. But we know that this is the case, this level 1, again, because this is part of what philosophy does, part of what philosophy investigates. is questions at this level. Again, the metaphysics of Aristotle, right? The ideas of Plato, Kant's transcendental categories would be these types of things. I'm not saying those philosophers are right or wrong. I'm just saying that those are examples of people who are doing things at this level, so to speak. Now, an atheist might want to say, I just deny all these things. There is no level 1. Everything is just level 2. You are falsely thinking there's this other level. Everything's level 2. It's very easy to refute that, right? You can easily demonstrate that the objects of this domain are literally not known empirically. So literally, there's no way to empirically prove all the things that David Hume points out you can't empirically prove. Right? So this is what David Hume does: is that he helps us to understand that, right? This stuff can't get you to this stuff, but this stuff presupposes this stuff, right? That's why Hume and Kant are valuable. Not because we accept their systems. Their systems are absurd. They lead to foolishness. But they're two philosophers who presented argumentation that showed the logic of unbelief, you see. So that's how we demonstrate that things at this level are circular at a paradigmatic or presuppositional level, and that's unavoidable. But when we talk about the day-to-day observations or the realm of science, we typically don't reference or allow for circularity. And in logic, this would be the fallacy of vicious circularity, right? If I said, for example, well, I know that we should always be truthful because there's just an inherent truthfulness to saying the truth. Okay, that would be vicious circularity. That would be a fallacy, right, at this level. And that's obviously different from a question like, how do I know that there is truth? That would be something at this level. And if I try to say, well, because of X, Y, Z, and you say, oh, but you're just assuming that there's truth to prove truth, I would say, yeah. But that's unavoidable for questions of preconditions. Preconditions will involve circularity at some point. And again, that's because every worldview will involve circularity when you get down to its ultimate presuppositional starting points. So for the unbeliever, his starting point is almost always invariably his own mind, his own human autonomy, right? That's his presuppositional commitment and starting point because he's fallen, right? From our vantage point, that's why. For the Christian, the ultimate vantage point, the ultimate starting point is God, right? And God is who undergirds these level 1 things, we could say. So as you guys know, when I present the transcendental argument, I typically, you can make a graph like this. The only thing is that I add one more step and I say, level 0 is God, right? The triune God undergirds level 1 and level 1 undergirds level 2. So hopefully that's helpful. I know there's a lot of words. That was just my made-up word salad to appear sophisticated. Literally none of those words actually have any meaning. Half of them I just made up, but hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, I wanted to play that whole bit through then because I wanted to give Jay the space to say all of that in his own words, and I didn't want to interrupt it too quickly because, like I said, I think that's the best bit of Jay Dyer on the internet, and it's where he's lucid. His idea is, I don't agree with pretty much anything he said in it, but I think that's the best he can do in that video. So I wanted to give him the time of day to play it all the way through. The kind of courtesy that he wasn't giving the opponents when we were playing clips of him earlier on in the video. And I think there's a couple of things that are really interesting about that. I guess the main thing to think is that, like, when he was moving from, he said, level 2, the empirical sense data stuff, to the transcendental objects, right? Which things, I think what he'd written up there was categories, presuppositions, and words have meaning were the things that he'd written up there. When he was moving from that one level to the level 2 to level 1, the only he gave 2 examples of how the argument's supposed to go there. One of them was the Aristotelian thing again, which I already showed. It's a terrible argument, it's not going to work. So that's out the window. Too bad for that one. The only other thing he said then was presupposing that words have meaning, right? And you've got to think that words have meaning because you'd be using words and then presupposing that they have meaning if you were going to try and refute the claim that words have meaning. And maybe on its face you think, well, that seems kind of plausible, right? You do have to presuppose that words have meaning if you're going to deny that words have meaning. It's just that, that's also a pretty terrible argument, right? Because what do you mean by meaning? I mean, there are theories of meaning that you might reject, right? So, for instance, you might have a kind of Phrygian theory of meaning, which basically says something like there are these abstract objects, things that sentences latch onto, they're propositions or whatever, and they're the kind of reified objects of meaning that sentences have derivatively by kind of pointing at them or by your intention connecting it to them or something, right? But then hello Wittgenstein, later Wittgenstein totally rejects that picture and constructs a completely different idea of what's going on when people are talking to each other, which is summed up obviously far too briefly by something like thinking that words that meaning use is meaning, right? Meaning isn't really a thing, right? He will deny that there is meaning in that sense of the Frege's idea, and instead, a bit like Hume offering some kind of reductive account of what causation is in terms of habitual expectation, Wittgenstein's going to say something like, well, look, there's just bunches of behavior, right? This is language games and blah, blah, blah. So you certainly can reject the thought that words have meaning. If meaning, means something theory-laden, right? Which Jay is always saying this stuff about there's no neutral way of assessing what people mean. Everything's totally saturated in the theories that they're surrounded by. But that just means that you can, of course, reject a given theoretical account of what it means for words to have meaning. So you can't just say, listen, using words presupposes that they have meaning. Only in the most thinnest, paper-thin sense that maybe I'll nod along and say, yeah, meaning, I guess. But in the back of my mind, I might be a Wittgensteinian and go, yeah, but what I'm saying is like stuff about behavior, cashing it out in terms of language games, blah, blah, blah. And if you're in the back of your mind thinking, I'm thinking about these Platonic objects, I'm thinking about it in a Phrygian sense, blah, 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 then of course we can disagree about that. That's just a thing philosophers can disagree about. And neither of them is like slam dunk presupposed just by using words, right? And so here we have two examples. One was everything presupposes a law of non-contradiction, and the other one seems to be everything presupposes some account of meaning, even though there's clearly diverging accounts of meaning that philosophers have put on the table. So Jay's method of just saying, well, everything must presuppose blah, 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 I think the cleanest way to think about it is that just he presupposes some folk theory of meaning. He presupposes some folk theory of logic. So when he says something, he's superimposing that onto the world, and he just thinks that you have to do that as well. But the argument is required, right? Just like with Aristotle, it doesn't just come for free. You have to actually argue for it, and you might give a terrible argument. And it seems to me that Jay does there for that. And we just don't get any other example given it, even though that's the best bit of Jay Dyer that I've ever seen. It just seems that it's like falls away when you actually look at it. Clearly, the idea he has in mind is clear that you have to presuppose these things, otherwise some terrible consequence will happen. It's just that he doesn't ever actually justify that claim. None of the things he says, and I've given him as much time as I could there to lay it all out, and I don't think he ever says anything better than that. And he constantly points towards Kant and says, well, it's a bit like Kant, but it's not really. It can't be anything like Kant. He says it's just like Aristotle, but if so, then it's terrible. And then the other thing we've got is this word, words must have meaning. What are you talking about, right? It seems like you're presupposing some folk theory of meaning without giving an argument for it. So I think it's just completely disappointing. And then if you think about it, let's suppose we grant him all of those things, even though there's no reason to do that. And we say, yeah, you're right, Jay, actually, whenever anything happens, I must presuppose all these Aristotelian categories of substance and like permanence and like spatiotemporal location and causality and whatever the fuck you want, right? You can have all of those things. Do those things presuppose the Orthodox God? Right? How do we get from those things to the Orthodox God? Because now, if we try and impose the same method again, it was already woefully implausible at the first, from level 2 to level 1. How good is it, plausibly, from level 1 to level 0, right? From the transcendental objects to the divine. Is it better now? Is it any good? Does it work? And I think the answer has to be, is it worse? Right? It's worse than that, because it seems like there's no direct way of going from suppose I think that there are, I don't know, Platonic, Phrygian meanings that exist in the world, and they have to exist for communication to be possible. How does that mean that the Orthodox conception of Christianity has to be true? Think about how much work you'd have to do to try and get someone to believe that, right? It's not going to be like with Aristotle. At least you can kind of be fooled if you squint at it, but by thinking, oh, I've said something and I'm committed to it being consistent, so I'm committed to this principle that everything is consistent. Like that, you could sort of, maybe, at least it's about consistency. But like if I presuppose numbers, Jay wants to say, well, numbers are grounded in God. But how? Why think that, right? You could be a divine conceptualist, like Plantinga was a divine conceptualist, but you owe me an argument. It's not going to be this same argument. It's not going to just be that, like, if I don't presuppose that numbers are grounded in the mind of God, then I'm contradicting myself. Of course I'm not. How is that? Show me the contradiction. Jay's never shown the contradiction for that. And in fact, what the contemporary mathematicians think is going on with grounding in terms of numbers, they think the natural numbers are grounded in the Zermelo-Fraenkel set theoretic hierarchy, right? You have the empty set, and you have the set of the empty set, you have the set that contains the empty set, etc. That's 0, 1, 2, 3, and it's a kind of potential infinite sequence that goes on forever, right? It's a well-founded sequence. They think that's, some of them do anyway, those who think there is grounding going on in that sort of sense. Why? Because it's got a structural similarity to the thing that they think is grounded in it. The numbers display the same structural properties as this set theoretic hierarchy. Now, okay, I'm not saying that's a good argument, but like, what's it got to do with the mind of God? Try and wrestle that argument off me, that position out of my hands, and then tell me that I have to believe that in its place, the thing that's grounding numbers is the Orthodox Christian God. Just try, help me out some way with that. So I think we just never get that argument. Sometimes Jay vaguely says things like divine conceptualism, and then he just keeps waffling on in a different direction. He never spends any time unpacking that. But I wanted to end on one bit that was quite funny, because there's another thing that Jay says a lot, which is about, so typically in the presuppositional arguments, they don't really get into this level of detail about the level 2, the level 1, blah, blah, blah. Jay wants to talk about that, and sometimes he says, well, you don't understand about paradigms and blah, blah, blah. And people just, well, what are you talking about? That video he was just explaining, and that's what he's talking about. But most of the time what happens is the discussion is just like, you say that whatever it is, the transcendental object presupposes that God exists. And then people go, well, how come I couldn't be just, an atheist Platonist or something? How come this worldview doesn't explain them and that worldview does? And basically, like I said, I think it just comes down to Jay. What he should do is just admit that this is an inference to the best explanation and try and motivate it being the best explanation. That's basically what he's doing anyway. But he insists, no, it's the impossibility of the contrary. Only the Orthodox Christian worldview is the only one that can ground it, that can give an account for it, that's coherent, that's consistent. All of the other ones are self-contradictory. They make knowledge impossible. All of this presup bingo terminology that we're so used to. Only the Orthodox Christian worldview can do that. And all of the others can't. So back in, 10 years ago or something, I wrote a blog post that seemingly is sometimes thrown as Malpass's Ass's sort of manifesto about the problem with tag. And one of the things was that I was arguing was, well, look, it just looks like there's an infinite number of possible worldviews. So if what you're saying is my worldview is the only one that's consistent and all of the others are inconsistent, then the burden that claim takes is you have to now show that an infinite number of worldviews are literally inconsistent. So you're going to have to show me what the contradiction is with an infinite variety of worldviews. And surely such a task is impossible. You're not going to be able to actually show that an infinite number of worldviews is impossible. Give me a second. Now, Jay's well aware of this objection. Maybe he doesn't credit it with me. Maybe I'm being big-headed and thinking that it's about what I said. But nevertheless, that objection exists, and people put it to Jay quite often. And he's developed a kind of response to it, which is to say, I don't have to refute an infinite. I don't have this infinite task like Achilles' tortoise or something. I have a finite set of things to do, and actually, it's not even that many, because what I can do is reduce the task by sort of categorizing out the worldviews and just knocking out one category at a time. And by that way, you can take what looks like getting rid of an infinite number of things. It's like imposing a measure on a real field or something, so that they can just say, this is the boundary between 0 and 1, and I can just knock that out. And that means I don't have to go through each of the points that exist between 0 and 1 on the real number line. Or it's like imposing a grid on top and then just like being able to remove sector by sector, and that way taking out chunks rather than individual points, right? So let's hear Jay doing that here. Bring your fucking video to play.
And this relates then to, you have to disprove every worldview. No, I don't. Because this is, again, a mistake. That was the first mistake, right, of not understanding higher order and lower order argumentation. When you confuse those two, that's when you might think, I have to disprove every single worldview. No, all I have to do is disprove, given what my argument is. So don't straw man my argument. If you want to deal with my argument is that every worldview has basic assumptions in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. You're very limited in the number of steps you can go in each one of those domains. For example, is reality created or uncreated, right? Is it eternal or does it have a beginning in time? Is knowledge possible or impossible? Is there an external world or not? Are there objective ethics or not? So I can structure a bunch of either ors, and every step that the theoretical opponent takes will determine the rest of that system down the road. But as you can see, you are actually very limited. So when we understand that this is actually how worldviews function, that every worldview by necessity can be boiled down to very limited either or starting points. There's not an infinite number of worldviews. The variations in worldviews are down the line.
There's only a certain number of questions or places that you even could start a worldview. So even if you came up with hypothetically some objection or some starting point that we haven't thought about, it's not going to really matter because, for example, any position that I take about, if I set up either or questions like, do you think the universe is teleological or disteleological? Right? That's a binary that either way you answer that is going to immediately determine many other aspects of your worldview. So do you see how any either or question that's a first principle, we could call it, for a worldview, it's automatically going to determine quite a bit about your worldview. And right away, you're already going to be stuck in a bind. So for example, the way that I answer that question, if I say, well, the universe, I think, is random, chaos, and chance. It's disteleological. It has no ultimate purpose or movement to it. If you go that route, you already boxed yourself into a bunch of problems, do you see? So I think it's just missing the point to say that, well, what if there's some other possible worldview? But there's not going to be that many possible worldviews or answers to intentional either or questions as first principles. Universe eternal or does it have a beginning? Are ethics objective or are they relative? Is there an external world or not? It's like any of the ways that you start to answer these, like you're immediately boxing in. You're not going to have infinite number of ways to go about answering those, because every worldview is forced into a limited number of starting points. Is the point?
Yeah.
All right. So play two different clips there back to back, just with him saying basically the same thing, and you can hear this a lot. I call this like the permutation of worldviews argument. So the whole point is he's trying to escape from the thought that you need to refute an infinite number of worldviews, which he thinks would be impossible. So, or at least one by one, having to go through an infinite number of worldviews, refuting each of them. And instead, he's saying there's only a limited number of first moves you can make, and that limits the cases down. So, I'll be able to knock them out more manageably, right? At least in principle. I seem to have gone out of focus for some reason. I think the microphone's getting in the way. I don't know if this helps. Does that then focus it back on? I don't know if that actually works. Anyway, so the methodology is clear there, right? But I thought, well, Jay says this so often, but he never actually specifies how many questions there would have to be in order for this method to be plausible or even effective, right? But he does emphasize over and over again that it's not that many, and it's got to be in ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. So let's suppose, for instance, and he often calls them either or questions. Is the universe teleological or disteleological? Does it have a beginning or does it not have a beginning? Is knowledge possible or is it not possible? Those are the types of examples that he gave, and he often gives. So, I mean, if you think about it, let's give this kind of absurdly simplifying assumption that there are 10 questions like that. Let's say there's 4 metaphysics questions, 3 ethics questions, and 3 epistemology questions, right? That seems crazy because, of course, there's just tons and tons of questions about epistemology that you might want to ask. So it's insanely simplifying, but let's just go with it for the sake of getting our heads around the numbers. Let's just assume for the sake of the argument that those questions are independent. So I could think that, externalism about knowledge is true, but also that the universe had a beginning. Or I could be an internalist about knowledge and think that the universe didn't have a beginning. Those two questions have nothing to do with each other, so we should have combinations of those positions available. And Jay's claim is that no matter which way you go on those, if you answer the questions wrong, it's going to mean that your worldview is inconsistent. But if you answer the worldviews according to the Orthodox picture, then you'll find that actually that's consistent. And that's the proof. That's the way that you can show every other worldview is inconsistent. His is the only one that works. But if you have 10 questions, 10 binary questions that are independent, how many combinations does that result in? Well, it's 2 to the power of 10. So that's 1,024 possible combinations. It doesn't seem like it in just 10 questions, but as long as their answers are all independent, it's 2 to the power of 10. So could Jay refute 1,024 worldviews? Maybe he could. I don't know. It's a sort of project you might commit yourself to writing a big book where you've got a chapter on each one of those, or a big series of books, and then Jay could prove that Christianity is true by doing that, right? So I think it's helpful to cash out what the sort of numbers are to get your head around the scale of the task. I mean, certainly refuting 1,024 worldviews would be easier than refuting an infinite number. So fair enough. But it can't be that really, can it? And here's now my argument, because let's think about if we did that methodology and we asked 4 questions in metaphysics, 3 in epistemology, and 3 in ethics, I don't think that would be fine-grained enough to be able to actually specify the doctrines of the Orthodox Christian worldview. Because, for instance, I'd have to ask at least, it can't just be, does the universe exist? Is reality real? Whatever these kind of boilerplate questions were that Jay was asking. I'd have to ask, does God exist? Did Jesus live? Is God triune? That would only just about get me basic bones Christianity. To get Orthodox Christianity, I'd have to have something about the Council of Nicaea, the authority of the patristic teachings. I'd have to have something about the energy essence distinction, blah 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 blah. Right? It's clearly I'd have to have a lot more questions than just those basic 10. I think that, let's say that Orthodox Christianity requires another 10 questions, drilling down through the different versions of Christianity before you get to the sect of Christianity that Jay thinks is the only one that can give you a coherent account of the transcendental objects or whatever. So if Jay's allowed to have, I mean, that seems right, because otherwise what would happen is you'd knock out all these sectors, right? And you could show maybe that every sector is inconsistent. But then, what would be the conclusion? Jay would say, well, but my worldview is not been shown to be inconsistent. But that would just mean that there are worldviews that are outside the grid that he imposed. What it would mean is that the grid that we put down is too coarse-grained to catch him. You'd be like a fish that darted through a net where the holes were too big to catch it. So in order to catch Orthodox Christianity, we'd have to make the net have much more finely grained in order to be able to catch it, right? How finely grained would it have to be to catch Orthodox Christianity? I suggest that another, absurdly simplifying assumption would be maybe another 10 questions about theology before we would nail it down to roughly what Jay would say. Probably more than that if you think about it realistically. I'm sure there's all sorts of inter-sectarian disputes between different types of Orthodox and different types of whatever. To capture Jay's view and say that's the only one that's going to give us the proper grounding for everything. Let's say 10 questions in addition to the ones we already had. But now, it can't just be that there are just like the 10 boilerplate questions, 4 metaphysics, 3 epistemology, 3 ethics, and then 10 very precise theological questions that narrow you down into Greek orthodoxy or whatever it is. It can't just be that, because that just seems completely ad hoc, right? The sort of thing Jay doesn't like ad hoc stuff. So in order to be sort of realistic about it, you should allow basically everybody the same level of fine-grainedness on their view that Jay's helping himself to. So if Jay's allowed another 10 very specific questions to define his view, then everybody should be allowed to do the same, right? So I should be able to not just have 3 questions about, say, ethics, but I should be able to drill deeper down into sort of, is it particularism or is it, emotivism and blah, blah, blah. I should be allowed to cut the pie as finely as Jay does, at the very least, in order to define a worldview with the same level of granularity that Jay does. So let's suppose then that there are 100 questions, not just 10. Even that seems like absurdly simplified, right? That just 100 questions in philosophy and every worldview would be captured with them. Just even then seems crazy, because it's like the openings of a game of chess or something. There isn't just 100 ways you can move in the first bunch of moves, right? There's millions and millions, but let's just say there's 100, right, different questions that you can have. And if we suppose that those questions are independent again, so that any combination could be had between them, I mean, maybe that's wrong, right? Maybe that's wrong, but balancing out against, I think, the 100 questions is a massive simplification. Independence helps with the maths, but maybe that's implausible as well, but it'll balance out somewhere around that. We're not now talking about 1,024 different worldviews. The number of worldviews, I can't even say it because the number is so big. That's the number, right? I mean, it's literally, I don't even know that there are words to express a number that's this big. And if you're listening along to this, the number's it's got like 30 digits or something to it. So that's 2 to the power of 100. Now, to get your head around the scale of that number, the number of particles in the universe is estimated at something like 2 to the power of 85. And 2 to the power of 100 completely dwarfs 2 to the power of 85, right? It's not just a bit different, it's immeasurably greater than that. So this number is like swamps the number of particles that there are in the universe. To get your head around what this means, if Jay did nothing but refute worldviews throughout the entire history of the observable universe, for 13.8 billion years, Jay just refuted worldviews at the rate of 2.9 trillion worldviews a second for 13.8 billion years, he would only just now have finished that task, right? And that's with the simplifying assumption that there are in fact only 100 questions that we would need to be able to define all of the worldviews that are possible. So I think this just kind of gets your head around the fact that, like, Jay's strategy here, okay, yeah, I guess in a sense you don't have to refute infinitely many worldviews, but being even moderately realistic about what the task entails that he's given himself, it still seems like that's not really helping him in any sense that makes any difference, right? The point I'm making is that, like, as far as I'm concerned, the move from level 2 to level 1, that is kind of empirical world, to this world of the transcendental objects. I might even pick fault with that distinction, but I suppose we go along with that distinction. The arguments that he gave from moving from that first level to the second level just seem hopeless. If we pretend that there is some argument that gets you from level 2 to level 1, the prospect of there being an argument that gets you from level 1, from the transcendental objects to the divine, his method for doing that, the one that he's championed, just seems completely, if you actually cash out the numbers in any sense, just seem completely hopeless as well, for a slightly different reason, right? He would have to be knocking out 2.9 trillion worldviews every second for 13.8 billion years to have got here. Maybe I was a bit off by my numbers, but you know what I mean? It's not going to make it go suddenly down to something like 100 or something, is it? So yeah, I think I'm going to stop talking about Jay Dyer now. I'm going to have a look at the questions, see if there's any chats going on. I think this is where I'm going to find out that I ended the stream an hour ago. All right, good. So first comment I saw, this is actually poor form here, Alex. Is it? What? Sorry, I don't know what you mean. All right, let's see. I'm going to look at the live chat so I can see if there's any super chats, and I'll kind of honor the donation. Someone's saying, do you have a link or phone call, the phone number I can call you live right now? No, I'm not doing live debates right now, thanks. Maybe a different day. All right, cool. Not seeing any direct questions. Happy to take questions if there are any now, or I could just go to bed. Malpass stream almost over with minimal technology issues. Yes, that's true. We almost got there. I think there were some. I will try and have tech issues next time. I kind of feel like the audience is missing it when there aren't any. So someone says, do you think that Dyer's argument, Steelman, has any force to it? Well, no. I mean, I've tried to genuinely do it as much justice as I think I can, and I've given you my reasons for thinking that doesn't work. So hopefully that, without just doing the whole 2 hours again, hopefully you can get there. Nathan says, question for Alex, how? Nice one. Thanks, Nathan. That's great. Why do you turn his transcendental argument into an inductive survey over every worldview? You're not addressing the actual argument. I am actually. I address exactly. I played a bit of Jay saying the thing himself before I did that. Jay says you can, you don't have to refute every worldview one by one. You can just examine the starting points and then take out chunks of worldviews in that way. So I did exactly what he said. That is his argument. So like, what does Jay mean by contradiction? He has to say that there's contradiction on X view and that they can't revise their view. I think maybe you're asking like whether there's some non-worldview notion of contradiction. I think that's another thing I've talked about before, which is I think it's a presuppositional method. You can get a bit hung up on what's a presupposition, what's on a worldview, blah blah blah. And actually, they often presuppose a lot of stuff that's neutral ground, like that contradictions are bad, blah blah blah. That you can actually rationally call into question, like so for instance, a dialetheist, etc., etc. So maybe Jay has a view about what a contradiction is, which also has this normative element, which is that it's bad and you can't have it or something. And then that's just presupposed without argument, and it's part of the machinery that he's sneaking in. So that all sounds right. Hopefully I got the idea of your question there. I've strawmanned both Jay and Tag. I mean, all right, I've done my best to play Jay saying the stuff that he said as much as I could. I let him talk for like 15 minutes in the middle, and if you think that's strawmanning, it's up to you. But, some people are just going to say that no matter what. I'm totally nuts and disconnected from reality. Okay, great. I kind of get the feeling that if I turned my eye towards Jay, that people would be annoyed about that. question, can't you refute worldviews in groups? For example, every worldview that doesn't have objective morality is false because objective morality is true. I mean, yeah, you could. If you can do that, then okay, great. Let's say we could just like refute every worldview that said that there was objective morality. But the question is like, can you? Like, is there actually a good argument for that? What you can do is like give an argument like a philosopher might give, but that doesn't mean that it's successful. Like Aristotle gave his argument for the presupposing the law of non-contradiction, but actually it's not game over once you've just given an argument. It actually has to be a good argument. And most of the time, I think if you're going to give an argument which is so wide-ranging and sweeping, the idea that it won't have any possible pushback or counterexamples is implausible. Is he just saying that there's a contradiction because God exists and every view believes the negation is contrary, but then he's already missing the agnostics? That every view that says God doesn't exist is contradictory because God does exist or something. Honestly, I don't know. I think that there's some there's just some like inability to understand how somebody might see the world differently that's going on with Jay. Like I said, I think that what am I trying to say? Now I'm feeling kind of tired. I can't remember what I was going to say already. I've forgotten. I'm just trying to read and think of answers at the same time is quite difficult, actually, it turns out. Did you see FDA's revised argument that attempts to avoid the refute 1000 worldviews? I didn't, but I mean, I think I need to like not think about Orthodox debate me bros for a bit. I do something else for a while, but I could come back to that. Bina Barry says, Alex, what's your thoughts on fictionalism regarding grounding? I mean, I think it's one of those questions where like grounding is like you could have different views on what grounds what in different areas. So you might find some account of grounding plausible in one area but not in another. So it's not just one of those things you can just say, I think this about grounding. I think it's more a question of like, if somebody proposes one thing grounding another thing, that's a sort of concrete proposal you might have a view about, but I'm not sure I can say anything about just grounding in general. Sometimes fictionalism might be appropriate and sometimes it might not be. Not sure that's very helpful. Modern Atheism says, do you think the problem of induction has any solution? Well, I mean, not straightforwardly, no. I mean, it's one of those perennial problems that's perennial. It sticks around. It's like hard solipsism or something. I think it's an epistemological problem, right? So like, if you're allowed to postulate metaphysical things, like that there are objects that have that obey the laws of nature or something, then you've got now a metaphysical kind of construction that from which you can derive expectations about what the future is going to be like. And you might think, oh, well, maybe I do know that the future is going to be like the past. But the problem is epistemological, because it's not about like, if I just postulate that some stuff exists, can I just rely on that stuff behaving the way I postulated it would do, like clockwork? It's about thinking like, well, any proposal that I make about how the world is going to be could be wrong, and it might just be whatever I've thought about, whatever I've experienced up till now, I could be wrong about that. So if I propose that, there are objects with consistent natures or something, and that they're going to behave like clockwork into the future, that thought might be wrong. I might be wrong about that. And as an epistemological thing, it does seem quite hard to get away from that. So, for instance, the presuppositionalist wants to say something like, they sort of press the epistemological part of that problem and say, you as an atheist can't get out of the problem of induction because you can't know as an empiricist that that the future is going to be like the past. But then it's like, well, how do you as a theist get out of that problem? And they just say, well, God tells me that the future is going to be like the past. But then here comes back the epistemological part of that problem again, because like, well, how do you know that when God said that was going to be the case, that it is going to be the case in the future? Oh, it's because God's like always truthful. Well, how do you know that? It's because he's been truthful up till now, because that's begging the question again. It's the same issue. Just, how do you know that God's nature is going to be truthful into the future? It's just another projection of induction. So I think that like it's not a problem for atheists. It's like the how do you get an ought from an is? It's just a problem for everybody. There's no like special theist outcome of this. What presuppositionalists do is just hijack philosophical problems and push them on you until you feel worried about them, and then very quickly tell you that that's not a problem on Christianity, and then hope you don't actually ask them exactly how that is. At least that's my view. Richard Carrier says, also, they can't refute groups of worldviews without presupposing their worldview, but the point is that things may ground in other worldviews, so they have to rule those out first somehow. And yeah, I think what you're getting at is this kind of issue of like doing an internal critique and not presupposing your own like framework when you're analyzing somebody else's. And I think that's kind of like it becomes this kind of like something quite similar in presuppositionalism with postmodernism, where you end up thinking that like there's no objective framework with which to like analyze a text or something, and or we're just stuck in our own heads or whatever. Philosophy Speak has sent me a gift. I don't really know what that means, but that's quite cool. Thank you very much for that. Hopefully that means money. That would be great. Felix again is asking for a phone number. Like, I'm not doing a debate right now, bro, so thanks, but that's not going to happen this evening. Someone says, who is FDA? Why is he compared to Jay? FDA is Father Deacon Ananias, and that's one of Jay Dyer's buds, and they do loads of videos together and put out content. Father Deacon Ananias is an Orthodox guy with a PhD and who does philosophy stuff as well. And then my last video is about him. Okay, I'm going to take one or two more. Question is Jay combining Heraclitus, Democritus, and Protagoras into one dude and then saying they led to Matt Dillahunty? Yes, I think that's probably right. And actually, I think it's that's right. In the Metaphysics 4, it's the followers of Protagoras who is actually the kind of villain, because Protagoras says something like all things are in one or something like that, and then Aristotle construes that as them being committed to a contradiction. So yeah, I don't think it's the sophists. I think Jay conflates the sophists with people who follow Protagoras. Oh yeah, Joe Davis asked, and I think you asked it before, about the virtuous vicious circularity distinction. I've never really seen a good way of just drawing that distinction. So like if like a vicious circle, you think it's some kind of like intellectual kind of faux pas, you're doing something like irrational or whatever when you're doing something viciously circular. So that's like something like justifying X with Y, but justifying Y with X. So the kind of like justification never seems to like get out of this. And you think, well, what's any justification for believing either of those things in the first place? So some kind of like that seems to be something like the problem. Okay, great. So what's virtuous circularity going to be? And I'm not really clear on that. I suppose the closest I can get to is that just sometimes people construe like coherentism in general, or kind of Quinean post two dogmas empiricism as circular, but I'm not sure that that's even fair. I mean, like it's certainly not circular in the same way. Like coherence epistemology seems to me it's not foundational, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be necessarily circular as a consequence, like as if it's just Agrippa's trilemma and there's nothing else. But anyway, Alejandro Severetto, have you talked about divine conceptualism with anyone after James Anderson? Not like critically. No, not really. I've talked to people. I've talked informally to philosophy friends of mine, but I've not like had a debate with a Christian about divine conceptualism since then. No. Bina Berry says metaphysical grounding I'm thinking about specifically. So you're talking about metaphysical grounding and in terms of like fictionalism. I think I'm still going to have to beg off that question for now. My brain's just not really working as much as it might do because it's like 10:30. So I think I've had a moderator in the chat doing the Lord's work, weeding out crazy people. It looks like. So we haven't had a moderator before. I like to think this is a nice community of people, but obviously there are sometimes some people, and if I'm going to be picking on Jay Dyer, we can only expect that there would be a couple of crazies in the chat. Yeah, look, Felix, I don't know how to say this any more times, man. I'm not going to take a phone call now. I'm going to go to bed in a minute. So another day, bro. All right. And in fact, I think I'm just going to like call it a day there. So thanks very much for all of this stuff, and like and subscribe, and you know the deal, blah, 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 whatever. I'll put out a post in a few days and we'll start gathering in some more ideas for something else to do next time. But it's not going to be pre-sup, at least for a bit. Do something else. Probably not Kalam and not precept. We'll do something slightly different. And yeah, like the stream, do whatever social media things. And then, all right, last thing, Joe Davis, Alex, will you talk to Jay again or forever? No. I mean, I just think he's a bit of, I just don't really know. I think the answer is no. I think this is probably it. All right, cool. On that bombshell, I'll see you next time.